Hi, everyone. I wanted to go over with you Module 2 and your journal options. Module 2, we are discussing Eastern tradition and thought and comparing and contrasting that to the West. So we'll be using our Venn diagram, like we before, for outlining and organizing our thoughts. We are comparing and contrasting religions and philosophies, and those still serve as our artifacts because they are tied to the sacred texts in which they're codified. So those texts serve as our artifacts, and we're able to compare and contrast things like the Vedas and the Upanishads and the teachings of the Buddha to Western things like philosophies codified by Aristotle and Plato, or the Abrahamic religions, because all those are found in actual artifacts. So we're starting with the oldest religion, and that is Hinduism. Hinduism was written down somewhere around 2700 BCE in the Vedas, which are the sacred texts of the Hindus. To put that in perspective, that's about 2,000 to maybe 1,700 years before the Old Testament's written, before Aristotle's writing, and before the Buddha's teaching. So it's an ancient religion, and it's been passed down from generation upon generation through several sacred texts. First one is the Vedas, the second one is the Upanishads, and the third is the Bhagavad Gita, among others. And so these serve as the basis for trying to understand Hinduism. So Hinduism typifies Eastern thinking because it celebrates becoming and it focuses on becoming. Where in the West, we tend to focus on being. I'll spend more time talking about that later in later videos, but for now, just know that when we talk about things in an Eastern philosophy, we tend to do so in terms of verbs and in terms of transformation. When we talk about Western philosophy or Western religion, we tend to talk about things in terms of being or in nouns and adjectives, right? So Western philosophies tend to think about the person, whereas in Eastern philosophies, it's the person's life and its transition and how that person is embedded in their community, in their family, and their tradition. All right. So I'm going to go over Hinduism, and as I'm doing that, what I'd like you to do is think, hey, that kind of sounds like. How does that sound like something from the West, right? Something from like Western philosophy or Western logic or Western religions, and try to make those comparisons as I go. All right, so Hinduism starts with three major gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Now, Hindus are polytheists, which means they believe in many gods, but Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are the main. Now, they are the embodiment of a universal spirit that goes through all of the Hindu gods. And some Hindus are actually almost monotheistic in that way because they believe that really there's just a god, and that spirit then transmits through many different gods and different entities, including people. But traditionally, the three major gods are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is the creator god, and his job is to create the universe and to do creation throughout the universe. Vishnu is the sustainer god, and his job is to nourish everything, right? So when I was in graduate school, I was taught that Vishnu is like the guy who waters the flowers, right? Like his job is to water the plants and help them grow. But he does so also spiritually. He feeds people spiritually so they can grow throughout their lifetime. And then Shiva is the destroyer god, and his job is to destroy and break things down so that Brahma can recreate and Vishnu can sustain again. Now, a lot of times Westerns are like, oh, Shiva, he's the bad guy, and not at all. Shiva is considered an incredibly vital part of the creation story, right? So without destruction, there could be no creation. Another way to think of this would be is if Brahma only created and there was no one there to destroy after he created, everything would become overpopulated and overcrowded, and there'd be no room for new, right? It always would just be the same. So Shiva is incredibly important. In fact, he's very well worshipped and regarded in India. From those three gods, we get the sacred teachings of how the universe works. And there are four major principles in Hinduism which are codified, like I said, the Upanishads, the Vedas, and the Bhagavad Gita, among other parts of Indian literature and religion. So the first of those is Dharma. So Dharma is typically tied to the caste system. And the way Dharma works is that Dharma is your sense of duty to the world and to your community. And it's linked to your caste system because based on your caste, you have a specific Dharma. You should be carrying out your life as best you can in your caste. Meaning, if you're a farmer, you should do whatever you can to be the best kind of farmer there is. Now, there's a really great story called the Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu comes down to earth as an avatar. And so that means he takes on human form. And his best friend Arjuna, who is a warrior prince, is lamenting his life because he has to go out and be a soldier and kill, and he doesn't want to do that. So Vishnu, as Krishna, says, well, you have to understand your duty. Your duty isn't to you. Your duty is to the world. Better to be a terrible warrior but try your best than to, become a priest or become a merchant or something like that, right? Now, this has got a really interesting sociological and political kind of aspect to it, and that is in India, right, following the caste system, historically, you would never have had a shortage of things that you needed, right? You wouldn't have shortages of merchants and craftspeople and herders and warriors because they always pass it from generation to generation, from father to son, from family to family, right? So there's a really interesting thing here because that just says there's a lot of stability in the way society is organized. For instance, in our own society today, we have got a shortage of nurse practitioners. We have an overabundance of people who want to be YouTube famous, right? That would never happen in the caste system because you wouldn't have anybody being YouTube famous, and you would have a shortage of nurse practitioners because the nurses would pass it on from generation to generation. Now, there's issues, of course, with the caste system, and today in India, it is not an official system, right? It's actually been disbarred by the government. However, in practice, it still functions pretty much the same. This caste system is very similar to class systems that we have in the West, right? And so one of the things that you can think about, though, is that this stability creates some kind of anxiety because, say, I don't want to be a merchant or I don't want to be a warrior. What do I do? Well, it turns out there is a solution to that, and that'll come up in a minute here when we talk about Samsara. Okay, the next piece of how you should live as a Hindu is karma. Now, in the West, we typically talk about karma as what goes around comes around, or karma will come kind of bite you if you do some bad things. It'll come back at you, those kind of things. And there's some truth in that. But my favorite line from the Upanishads explains karma like this: the doer of good becomes good. The doer of evil becomes evil. One becomes virtuous by virtuous action, bad by bad action. And what this means is that instead of just doing good things in the world and kind of just like tallying it up and see how good you were and how bad you were at the end of your life, what this means is that you should become a force of goodness in the world, right? I often think of like our great leaders, our great peace leaders in our time, where they cease to be an individual and they become a force of goodness. They cease to be in a person and they spread amongst us all, right? So a great example of that would be Martin Luther King Jr., right? Although he was a person, he seems to be bigger than that person, right? He seems to have become a force that travels throughout our world, right, and throughout our country. And during, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, our kids kind of, we learn about him, we celebrate him, we talk about civil rights, and we talk about diversity. And so he ceased to be an individual because of all the goodness he did, right? So that is the idea behind karma, is to do as much good in the world as you can, always following your dharma, and being this force of goodness. Now, following your dharma and accumulating good karma leads us to the samsara cycle. The samsara cycle is the reincarnation cycle, or cycle of rebirth. The way it works is that as you die, you'll be reincarnated in your next life as a new human being. Your soul will pass from one stage to the next stage when you're born. Now, if you were a good person in your former life, you had good karma, you did goodness in the world, and you followed your dharma. No matter what your dharma was, you followed that duty. Then when you're reborn, you actually move up the caste system. So you start moving up the rungs, right? So that kind of solves that problem of, well, I don't want to be a warrior. It's okay, be a warrior as best you can now, and then later in life you'll come back as something else. Okay? That kind of solves that social issue that you might have. From a spiritual sense, it's about growth, and it's about becoming a better version of you each time you go through life. And whatever you learn in your past life influences new life. But moving up the rung or continuing to reincarnate is actually not the goal of the Hindu. The goal of the Hindu is to release, or moksha. So moksha is to get away or get out of that cycle. And so the way you do that is you continue to work on yourself, become wise, study the Upanishads and the Vedas, learn from sacred stories like the Bhagavad Gita, become a better version of yourself each time you're reborn. And eventually, when you hit enlightenment and you become this enlightened, wise being who is so well schooled in the thoughts of Hinduism and who has become such a spiritual leader in the world, you can release yourself from the samsara cycle. So a lot of times Westerners will say, well, what happens to you? Well, you enter the oneness of the universe. And again, a lot of times Westerners struggle with that because the idea is, well, wait a second, I'm a me, I'm a noun, I'm a being. You have to remember, in Eastern philosophy focuses on becoming. And so in that case, becoming one with the universe itself or with God itself is the full goal of Hinduism. All right, so let's compare this then to Western ideas, right? Because both the West and the East have had addressed this question of how we should live. So in the East, especially through Hinduism, we've got our four major principles: Dharma, Karma, Samsara, and Moksha. And that is how you live. Now in the West, we tend to have different ideas, right? We have different ways of approaching what is the way to live. So for some of us, we live by philosophy, right? So we might use things like Plato and Socrates and Descartes and Locke and live by those philosophical premises, right? For instance, the United States of America, that country was developed as a philosophy, right? It's rooted in the tenets of Locke, Jefferson, and Franklin, and Madison. These guys, when they were writing this stuff, they were using Greek and Roman philosophy to highly influence their way of approaching the world. In the West, we also tend to focus on individualism, so that idea of being, right? So that, like, I am entitled to the fruits of my labor. The work I do in the world comes back towards me, right? So we have that deep focus on the self. Western ideas tend to lead towards capitalism, right? So not always, but a lot of Western cultures are based on capitalism, which really focuses on individualism and property rights. Again, going back to places like philosophy, like Thomas Hobbes, where you have lots of ideas about property rights, about liberty. These things all play into the idea of capitalism. And then lastly, some of us adhere to Abrahamic religions. Abrahamic religions are the three monotheistic religions in the world that all trace their history back to Abraham. So that's going to be the Jews, that's going to be Christians, and that's going to be Muslims. Right? So all three of those religions link back to the same source, which is the covenant of Abraham. Okay, so looking at the Western ideas, there's clearly some differences between West and East, but there are also many, many similarities, right? The fact that there are three major deities, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and they all are made up of the same God stuff, or the same divine essence, right? That certainly permeates in a lot of different Western ideas, right? For instance, just the rule of threes, this idea that three is a very sacred number, or that it's an important number. We use it in pretty much every one of these Western categories, right? So you'll see there's lots of overlap between Dharma, Karma, Samsara, and Moksha with the West. One of my favorite statistics is when you poll American Christians. So this came out of a Pew Research poll in 2008. If you ask them if they're to believe in the Christianity divined by the Bible, they will say absolutely. And if you ask them if they believe in reincarnation, somewhere between 40% and 60% of American Christians believe in some form of reincarnation, which is an antithesis to Christianity, right? But it's borrowed from the East. You can see there's lots of overlap and connections between these worlds as well as differences. Okay, so that's the first journal option, to compare the Hindu belief system, the most ancient of the Dharmic traditions, to the philosophies, the religions, and the ideas of the West. Now, there are other Dharmic religions. There's actually four. So there's Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. Each of them has the same major tenets of Dharma, Karma, Samsara, and Moksha. However, they'll redefine Dharma. So the splits between the Eastern religions is how they define Dharma, and in some cases, how they define Moksha, right? But in essence, they're all rooted in the same idea. They just splinter off. In some ways, it's very similar to Christianity between Lutherans and Protestants and Catholics and Mormons. They're all rooted in the same idea, but they splinter off from one another. Okay? So the other Dharmic religion we're going to focus on is Buddhism. So the story of the Buddha is told throughout different parts of the world, but Buddha was likely a historical figure. If he was, he lived in modern-day Nepal around 500 BCE, give or take. So that's if there was a historical Buddha, that's probably who he was. He is a sacred figure in all the Dharmic faiths, and also in the Chinese traditions, which we'll talk about later. So the real quick gist of the Buddha's story is that the Buddha was born as a prince named Siddhartha, but he lived in such opulence and with such kind of, all of his needs were met that he didn't feel very fulfilled. He eventually abandons his wife, his children, and his princedom and ceases to be royalty in order to go on this spiritual journey. Now, Buddhists teach that the way Buddha did this was that he fought internal demons, specifically the demon Mara, and he had a battle internally to try to understand suffering and to understand how life works. And as he overcame that demon Mara, sitting under the Bodhi tree, he meditated for days upon days, fasting and just thinking about and contemplating the universe. And at some point, it becomes clear to him, and he becomes the enlightened one. And that's when he transforms from being Siddhartha to the Buddha. And that enlightenment is encaptured in the Four Noble Truths. There are other things that he also shared with his followers, the three jewels, but the Four Noble Truths are probably the most important tenets of Buddhism. And what they do is they redefine Dharma. So it's no longer connected to the caste system whatsoever. It's no longer connected to duty. Now Dharma is about how an individual deals with suffering. So the Four Noble Truths were, one, to live is to suffer. What that simply means is that to be born and to live a physical life means you're going to have pain. And to spend our entire lives seeking only pleasure and the avoidance of pain creates our problems, right? So we have to just accept that we are going to suffer. And that the cause of our suffering is typically desire, that our desires for more lead us to more suffering. We usually are left unfulfilled. The end of our suffering then is to live in moderation. And specifically by practicing the Eightfold Path, which are 8 different steps that can be summarized as cultivating wisdom, cultivating ethics, and meditating. You'll notice as you hear this that a lot of these ideas out of Buddhism, we hear a lot in the West, especially when you talk about like mental health and self-actualization and self-growth and self-help, like these movements that we have in our culture. You'll see there's a lot that parallel to Buddhism, right? The idea that the first step of any problem is accepting that you have a problem, that desire and that addiction and that dependence and reliance and these things, they tend to cause a lot of our pain. And that living in moderation is probably the best way to go, right? Not having too much, not too little, but just having enough to be satisfied. And then this idea of wisdom, where we cultivate knowledge and experience, that we live ethically, and that we meditate, right? Meditation is this idea that like you become more centered and more peaceful and more mindful of who we are, right? These are all things that we see now here in the West. And although self-help books might claim that they're the ones that came up with this, it really points back to Buddha. Buddhism has entered into the Western dialect in several different ways. But one of the most significant ways comes from a German writer named Hermann Hesse. Hesse is famous for writing a number of books, Steppenwolf, Journey to the West. These are some of these great pieces of literature, transcendental literature that comes out of Germany. But one great book he wrote was Siddhartha. And what Siddhartha is a German or Western reinterpretation of the Buddha's story. Now, it follows very closely, but then it changes it in really drastic ways to help make it more palatable for the West. So it starts the same way that Siddhartha is a prince, and he abandons his station in life and goes on a search or quest for enlightenment. In this version, there's Siddhartha's on this journey with his friend Govinda. This is a very Western kind of trope where you have like a hero and a sidekick. And the two of them are out looking for the meaning of life. Now, Govinda will find it eventually by becoming a monk, and he'll be satisfied with that. Siddhartha, however, will not. He'll try being a monk, and that won't satisfy him. Then he'll try being a merchant, and that won't satisfy him. And eventually, he becomes so despondent, and he becomes so overcome with his depression and anxiety, he attempts to kill himself by drowning himself in a river. But a ferryman comes by, and he rescues him, and that rescue stimulates a whole kind of spiritual awakening in Siddhartha. So Siddhartha actually trains to become a ferryman, and as he's on this river, he's kind of listening to how the river, the waves kind of break across the rocks. He has this moment of clarity, and that moment of clarity is that everything is connected in a great big cycle. So sort of like the water cycle, right? Where the rain falls from the sky, the rain fills the oceans, the rivers, the water then evaporates, becomes clouds again, and it's this constant cycle. So this is Siddhartha's enlightenment, okay? And that he realizes that the life should be about humility and this illumination of the connection between people. And when he goes and finds Govinda, he tries to explain it to Govinda, but Govinda doesn't understand. And so instead, Siddhartha kisses Govinda on the forehead, and apparently there was this moment of illumination, and Govinda is also enlightened. So you can see very different story, right, from the original text. The original text talks more about an internal struggle with this demon of illusions, Mara, and this path of enlightenment, and after study and understanding of wisdom, ethics, and meditation, we can do things to end suffering and desire and living in moderation. Where in Hesse's version, it's more of like a classic Western journey, and he goes on this kind of self-exploration, but he has to face all these physical obstacles, right? And he tries his hand at becoming a monk, a merchant, a ferryman, and at the end, even after he becomes the hero, he can't share his wisdom, right? Like in the original, in the religious teachings of the Buddha, he shares his wisdom. But in Siddhartha, the only way that Siddhartha can share his ideas is to kiss Govinda and hope that that makes it work. But even then, like the reader is kind of left with this idea of like, well, is that actually what happened, right? Okay, so this will be another choice for your journal. You can compare the original story of the Buddha to Hesse's version, Siddhartha, so Eastern and Western interpretation of that tradition. Or you can do the Hinduism comparison from Hinduism to Western thought. I'll also be sending out more information about the other two Dharma traditions, that is Sikhism and Jainism. They're a little bit more minor as world history kind of unfolds. So I do those in a separate kind of context. Right? As always, thanks for watching, and if you've got questions, please do reach out. Thanks, everybody.